My mother and stepdad gave me just $100 and kicked me out after my stepsister was born, saying blood relations are everything. But when they found out I had moved into a mansion, they're now begging me not to forget that we're family. I've been waiting for this moment. Who are you? This is my experience of being kicked out of my home by my mother and stepfather. After my half-sister was born, I was thrown out of the house, and years later, I would take my revenge. I am 25 years old, and I was driven out of the house 6 years ago when my mother was 45. At that time my stepfather was 49. My half-sister is significantly younger than me. My grandparents, who were strict and traditional, forced my mother to have children. When my mother became pregnant with me, she wanted to keep it a secret. However, my biological father was unaware of this and announced it to her family before she could say anything. When my mother took a pregnancy test, my father was ecstatic about the result. Without waiting for my mother's confirmation, he shared the news with her family. They broke up shortly afterward. In fact, they were never married, and due to various obstacles, they eventually went their separate ways. My parents met after entering college and dated for a year. After discovering the pregnancy, my father foolishly abandoned my mother. However, my mother couldn't bring herself to get rid of me. Her family already knew about the pregnancy and threatened to disown her if she had an abortion, thus she had no choice but to give birth to me. This is a story I know very well. My mother told me this story many times, enough to make me realize how fortunate I am. If my mother had made a different choice, I might not be here today. She always said I was the product of my father's mistake, which fueled her anger. She seemed to harbor resentment towards me and felt raising me was a burden. My grandparents kept me as out of sight as possible, and my great-grandparents, who had already passed away by the time I was born, never knew what had happened. As my childhood came to an end, many difficult things happened to me, but they are hard to talk about. My mother felt burdened by me, but my father did not. My mother despised me, because she neither wanted me nor accepted me. If it weren't for family pressure, she would not have given birth to me. She also claimed that my existence hindered her career progress. She had to juggle college and work, and taking care of me meant sacrificing a lot. She resented this, and was strict with me. However, I lacked nothing during my childhood. My grandparents supported us financially. My father paid child support, but didn't show the kind of affection I wanted. To my mother, I was only a burden, and she had no high expectations for me. She never spoke to me warmly or showed any affection. Even when I achieved something, she didn't celebrate it and treated me like a difficult older roommate. She always harbored hatred towards me and wanted to kick me out of the house as soon as possible. On the other hand, my father felt kinder in comparison to my mother. However, he was powerless as a parent and struggled with substance abuse during my early years. At the time I didn't realize it, but now I'm sure he was dependent on marijuana. He often acted strangely and made bizarre comments, but it was mostly to entertain me. He never missed my birthday parties or family dinners, so I didn't think much of it. I don't hate him, but I often hear criticism of his actions. My mother didn't want me, but she didn't let go of me because of family pressure. My father lacked the ability to take care of me. Honestly, their judgment wasn't wrong. Decisions had to be made about who would raise me. Even before I was born, my mother's family put the responsibility on her, and my father only cared for me on weekends. When I was 10, I started living with my mother full-time. I could only see my father a few times a month. Eventually I was allowed to live with him only on weekends, but that didn't seem to go well. At just 10 years old, I realized my father was still not ready to take on the role of a parent. He lived in a modest apartment, couldn't afford the lifestyle my mother enjoyed, and was in a poor environment. The living room always carried the distinct smell of marijuana, and my mother constantly complained about it. My father wanted me to spend several days a week with him, but my mother opposed this, and only allowed weekend visits. Even so, the time I spent with my father brought me a bit of relief. Although family life wasn't ideal, at least I felt accepted. Despite being in a difficult situation, my father did everything he could for me. At times we only had one meal a day at his house, but he still tried to comfort me. My childhood was spent enduring constant pressure from my mother while needing to face my father on weekends. When I was 15, my mother met her new partner John. He wasn't a bad person, but he wasn't particularly great either. To be honest, he was indifferent to me, but he was still better than my mother. My father wasn't particularly interested in me either, but talking with him gave me a sense of reassurance. My mother and John spent several days together and got married when I was 17. 2 years later, when my mother became pregnant again, I didn't worry much about it. For me, it didn't affect my daily life, and I continued my usual routine. At 18, I chose to take a gap year, and pursued practical work experience instead of immediately going to college. However, I later regretted this decision. My grandparents were prepared to pay for my college education, but shortly after I turned 18, My mother and grandparents had a fierce argument, which resulted in the end of financial support for me. This forced me to live independently, but I managed to support myself through an internship I had joined at the time. When I was 19, I applied to a university and was quickly accepted. At the time, my mother was 7 months pregnant, but she didn't provide me with any information. Eventually, my half-sister was born. After returning home from the hospital, my mother and John sat me down for an important conversation, and I was a bit surprised. My mother said, "The new baby needs a new room in the house." They mentioned hiring a full-time babysitter and setting up a room for her. It was time for me to give up my room and leave the house. Since I was already 19 and legally an adult, staying at home felt unnatural. At that time, I considered moving in with my father. However, he was struggling with drug issues and had also developed a gambling addiction. His home had become a place no one wanted to visit anymore. Until then, my maternal grandparents had been very close to my mother, so there had never been financial concerns. They were willing to support me for my mother's sake. However, after my mother's fight with them, their relationship ended, and so did their bond with me. I had no choice but to accept this reality. I tried contacting them several times, but was unsuccessful. The situation deteriorated to the point where I was nearly thrown out. However, I decided to pay for my own college tuition. Since I was pursuing an education, I expected my mother to contribute during the application process. I understood that my mother hated me, but attending college meant becoming independent from my family, so she ultimately agreed to support me. Later, she told me she would kick me out of the house. I asked her for financial assistance for my college education, but she looked at me, laughed, and said, "Not only am I going to kick you out, but I'm also cutting all ties with you. Here's $100. Get out of here." She then threw $100 at me. I was stunned and shocked by her coldness. I never imagined someone could be so cruel. When I started crying, she frowned and said, "If you're going to cry, do it outside." She didn't want her house to be sullied. Before that day, I had been living relatively contentedly, though I never voiced anything to my mother. I wanted to avoid arguments with her and didn't want to waste my time. However, on that fateful day, speaking up for myself ultimately led to me being thrown out of the house. On the surface, I remained silent, but deep down, I felt she was an incredibly awful mother. Finally, I became certain that removing her from my life would significantly improve my future. She declared without looking back, "It doesn't matter. I have my husband and my real daughter. So I don't need you anymore." Upon hearing those words, I felt deep despair once again, and thought, this is the worst day of my life. Still, I managed to stay somewhat composed, packed my belongings and left that house. Since that day, I have never looked back at that house. The $100 handed to me as severance money. What could I possibly start with that? In reality, it was impossible to hope for any significant change with that amount. I immediately headed to my father's house, determined to improve my situation from scratch, no matter how difficult it might be. When I arrived at my father's house, he was in terrible shape, and the condition of the house was even worse. The floors were covered in trash, with no sign of cleaning having been done. My father had been unemployed for a long time and had lost his funds through gambling. Moreover, after his father passed away a few months earlier, he squandered the inheritance left to him. My father was happy to see me again, but he was high on drugs and unable to hold a coherent conversation. That day I was already feeling down and at my limit. When I saw my father smoking marijuana, I grabbed his hand tightly and pleaded, "You need to act like a real father." I felt that his unhealthy habits could destroy my life as well. Being kicked out by my mother and unable to rely on my father only deepened my despair. At that moment, I picked up some marijuana that had fallen on the floor, filled with disappointment and regret. Overcome with despair, I struck my father once, then immediately apologized, but he stormed off to his room in anger. In the end, I spent the night in the living room. The next morning, my father asked me what had happened. Now sober, I told him everything. I explained the situation in detail and told him that I needed his support and that his cooperation was essential. For that to happen, he needed to quit gambling and drugs. When my father learned that my mother had kicked me out, he was shocked. He tried calling my mother, but she didn't answer. That day, I decided to live with my father. Although he didn't have financial stability, he promised to do his best for me. However, the process was far from easy and was a constant struggle. There were times when my father would revert to his old habits, but I continued to support him. He promised me, "I'll keep trying." It was disappointing that I couldn't attend college, but I couldn't waste time. So I applied for multiple internship programs. I received offers from several companies, some with good pay, but I had to decline them due to the long working hours and my family situation. At that time, my father showed no willingness to improve his life. While seeking support from my father, I resolved to improve my own situation as much as possible. Whether I was working or not, the house had to be clean and organized at all times. However, my father continued living the same lifestyle as before. He had been searching for a job for a long time, but employers avoided him due to his tarnished reputation. In the past, he had struggled with addiction issues at work, which became a significant obstacle for both him and me. Amid these hardships, 3 years ago, we finally experienced a stroke of luck. My father began working as a store clerk, though the pay was low and the hours were long. I worked as an accountant, which was a boring desk job. However, a high school friend from another state offered me a job through her father, who was opening a new branch. Her parents divorced years ago, but every time she returned during holidays, we met up. She understood my past difficulties and even offered financial support for my college tuition, but I couldn't bring myself to accept her money. I couldn't bear the burden of debt. Her father ran a major office supply business and recently decided to expand his operations. When she offered me this new job, I agreed to take it. I also suggested that my father work as a warehouse manager. Given his qualifications and prior experience, it was an ideal position for him. Thus we moved into a new phase, and things started to take a turn for the better. My father has completely stopped using marijuana and no longer gambled. We moved into a better living environment, and things have been going smoothly for the past 2 years. 6 years ago, it would have been impossible to imagine our current state. I hadn't been in contact with my mother for a long time, but 2 weeks ago, she reached out to me. She seemed to be in need of some help. I sensed that something serious was happening. Shortly after I left home, she quit her job and started a new business with John, but it didn't last long. I don't know the exact reason, but they kept pouring money into it and eventually went bankrupt. They were left with an enormous amount of debt and had to sell everything they owned to repay it. Through relatives, she seemed to have heard that my father said, "We've moved to a better home and are satisfied with our current life." For that reason, she decided it was appropriate to reach out and ask for help. She didn't apologize, but simply said, "Come back home." She also asked me to forget all the past. She mentioned she had a young daughter and was worried about her future. And if I had the capacity, she wanted me to support them and take on some of their debt. I was astonished by her bold demands. It was as if she hadn't considered at all how she had treated me in the past. I pretended to agree with her over the phone and decided to listen to her for a few days. But to be honest, I had no intention of giving her any money, nor did I have any intention of solving her debt problems. I told her, "I'll look into it," but I wasn't sincere, and planned only to listen to her. What she mainly talked about were their financial troubles, but from the beginning, I had no intention of helping them. This entire approach was calculated, but she didn't realize it and showed no sign of apologizing to me. As a result, any guilt I might have felt about my actions gradually faded. 2 days ago, she finally contacted me asking for financial support. I responded clearly, "I can't send you money." She realized she'd been deceived, and I reminded her of how she had treated me in the past, including how horribly she had treated me as a child. I felt it was completely unreasonable for her to expect help from me. Since she had never apologized, I told her I had no reason to hold any expectations for her. "You were a horrible person and an even worse mother. Did you ever think about me even once?" I said to her. And before she could say anything, I hung up the call. After that, I ignored all further attempts from her to contact me. Eventually, her attempts to reach me stopped. My relatives have already read the posts I wrote about my mother and understand how she treated me in the past. It was necessary to bring the truth about her to light. My mother always pretended to be kind and a successful career woman, but it was all a facade. I believe my actions were justified, but my father thinks I went too far. He said, it would have been enough to just ignore her. I agree with his point that playing games with someone seeking help is cruel. However, all of this was intentional on my part. I feel it is fair, since my mother was once cold and cruel to me. Not everything has to be perfect like in the movies, nor do I feel obligated to set an example for others. Still, my father says that was excessive. And now I'm wondering if I should apologize. I'm questioning whether paying off my toxic mother's debts and supporting her afterward is truly the right thing to do. I felt the need to discuss past events and decided to sit down and talk with my father. In the end, I'm glad I did so. My father wasn't always a very proactive parent. For most, if not all, of my childhood, he was high and didn't care about anything. My father barely remembered how terribly my mother treated me or how she behaved toward me. He enjoyed spending time with me, but wasn't truly there for me. My father recognized that my actions were rooted in anger. My behavior was the result of years of accumulated resentment. He also understood that it wasn't right. Even if it wasn't moral or ethical, my mother had no intention of apologizing, and I had no intention of apologizing to her either. I was shocked that, despite never having apologized, she still expected help from me. It has been a week since I last heard from her. While I've received many messages from various people, I have no interest in talking about my mother anymore. I have plenty of other work to deal with and no time left for drama. About 2 weeks after our phone call, my mother contacted me again saying, "I regret trusting you." She admitted she regretted having a daughter who betrayed her despite trusting me, but I felt the same way about her. My childhood was so difficult because of her that I sometimes felt it would have been better to be an orphan. My mother no longer lives in this town, saying she left out of shame and humiliation, but honestly, I don't care at all where she is now. Wherever she is, it no longer affects my life. She blocked me on social media, and we both agreed to stop contacting each other. A month has passed since my mother moved and things have quieted down significantly. According to relatives, she isn't talking to any family members or anyone else. This might be for the best for her. My father and I are still doing well. My father recently got a raise, and our life is going smoothly. I still haven't been able to attend college, but I hope to go someday when I have more stability. Recently, I heard that my mother is going through divorce proceedings with John. At first, I was surprised, but thinking about her personality, it wasn't that shocking. She says she's worried about me, but it's hard to take her concerns seriously. I hope this situation isn't just another one of her schemes. For now I'm focusing on my work, my health, and my relationship with my father. The only thing that weighs on my mind is my half-sister. What kind of environment is she growing up in? It pains me to think that she might continue to grow up under such a mother. I used to believe that my mother was at least kinder to her than she was to me, but then an unexpected message arrived. Is this my big sister? Was the message sent from an unfamiliar number? The message was from my 6-year-old half-sister. She had secretly borrowed my mother's phone to contact me. According to her, she knows me as the amazing and cool big sister who does great work. I was surprised to hear that my mother spoke about me so positively. I had never received such recognition before. My sister told me that things between my mother and John were terrible and that the household was always tense. Hearing that my 6-year-old sister felt lonely in such a difficult family environment broke my heart. When she said, "I want to meet you," the barriers in my heart began to crumble. I never imagined that my sister saw me this way. For 6 years, I hadn't been able to see her because of my mother and John. Despite that, she had loved me as her big sister with a pure heart all this time. Our first meeting took place at a park. It was a secret meeting, without my mother knowing. My sister cherished a photo of me and spoke excitedly about her dream of wearing a suit and working like my big sister. Later, with the divorce of her parents and worsening financial difficulties, her situation became even more unstable. Despite my hesitation, I couldn't abandon her as her older sister. In the end, my father and I took her in. We faced many difficult situations to get to this point, but now it feels like the best decision. My father has completely overcome his past issues with drug addiction and gambling, and has become a great support for my half-sister. For him, her presence has been a new beginning in life. My mother eventually agreed to let us live with my half-sister. We've arranged for my mother to meet with her daughter once a month, but I still haven't faced my mother directly. While my half-sister's relationship with my mother is separate, my feelings toward my mother remain complicated. When I think about the past, I find it hard to forgive her. However, my half-sister's innocence slowly melts away the bitterness in my heart.